Look back at verses 4 through 8. Jesus fully realized all that was going to happen to them, so he stepped forward to meet them. Who are you looking for? He asked. Jesus the Nazarene, they replied. I am, and I'm going to read it this time, he. I am he, Jesus said. Judas, who betrayed him, was standing with him. As Jesus said, I am he, they all drew back and fell to the ground. Once more he asked them, who are you looking for? And again they replied, Jesus the Nazarene. I told you that I am he, Jesus said. Now I emphasize the word he because I want you to notice that it's italicized. The reason it's italicized is because it's not in the original Greek manuscripts. It's been added by the translators. What it actually says in the Greek, I'm going to read it from Greek and then I'll translate it for you. Apokritheson auto. They answered him. Iesun ton Nazarion. So they answered him, Jesus, did I say they asked him? They answered him, Jesus of Nazareth. Lege autos. He said to them, Ego eimi. Ego eimi. Ego eimi is literally translated, I am. Ego means I. Eimi means I am. The I's already in it. He says, Ego I am, because he wants them to know I and I alone. I am. Yeah. Now, people, this is the very same phrase that God used when he identified himself to Moses. Remember when God told Moses to go to Egypt? And Moses is a type of the Messiah, is a type of Jesus. And he tells them to deliver his people from the bondage of Egypt, just as the true Messiah would deliver us from the bondage of sin. But Moses says, who do I say has sent me? And God said, you tell them, I am has sent you. The only difference in the phrase that Jesus used and God used is the language in which it was spoken. Jesus spoke it in Greek. I am. God spoke it in Hebrew. And every Jew was familiar with the great I am, whether it was spoken in Greek or Hebrew. In fact, when Jesus identified himself as the great I am, notice what happened. Look back at verse 6. As Jesus said, I am, they all drew back. In other words, they went backwards and fell to the ground. It didn't mean they stepped backwards. It's very fluid in the Greek. They went backwards and fell to the ground. Beasley Murray, who's the author of the Word Biblical Commentary, calls this a mysterium tremendum. That's Latin. It means a terrifying mystery of the ultimate reality. In other words, they came face to face with God in the flesh. And look what happened. They all fell to the ground backwards. They were laid out flat on their back, slain in the spirit, if you will. People, if Jesus had wanted to leave at that point, him and his disciples could have just left. But he didn't do that. In fact, what he does is he steps forward and towards them. And again, he asked, who are you seeking? And they kind of come out of it. Look back at verses 7 and 8. Once more, he asked them, who are you looking for? And again, they replied, Jesus the Nazarene. I told you that I am, Jesus said. And since I am the one you want, let these others go. Do you see that? Jesus said, I told you that I am. Jesus said, and since I am the one you want, let these others go. At the point where Jesus is about to experience the very worst moment in the history of the world, and for himself personally, he's thinking about his disciples. And because he is the great I am, they didn't even question his request to let his disciples go. They're free to go. He's got the authority. Jesus is orchestrating everything at this point. But of course, that's when Peter steps in and he screws everything up. But that's okay, because Jesus fixes screw-ups. You know, I always wonder what God could do in my life if he wasn't always having to fix my screw-ups. And I wonder what he could do in your life if he wasn't always having to fix your screw-up. Yeah, your screw-ups. Now, to really understand what Peter did, we need to read this event from the book of Matthew, chapter 26, verses 50 through 54. We get the details in the Synoptic Gospels. Notice what it says. Jesus said, my friend, go ahead and do what you have come for. Then the others grabbed Jesus and arrested him. But one of the men with Jesus pulled out his sword and struck the high priest's slave, slashing off his ear. Now, we know from the others that it was Peter that did this. Put away your sword, Jesus told him. Those who use the sword will die by the sword. Don't you realize that I could ask my Father for thousands of angels to protect us, and he would send them instantly? But if I did, how would the scriptures be fulfilled that describe what must, the Greek word day, happen now? Good old impetuous Peter. He grabs a sword, a machaira, not a knife, a sword that he's been carrying around. And he swings it at the head of the high priest's servant, Malchus, cutting off his ear. He wasn't trying to cut off his ear. He's trying to split his skull open. Now, people, that's assault and attempted murder on the high priest's servant who is on an official mission sent by the high priest himself. You see, we read that high priest servant and we don't understand because we don't live at the time of Jesus within the Jewish culture. The high priest servant was not a servant the way we think about it. He was an assistant to the high priest. Think of him as the vice president to the president. In fact, Josephus tells us not just about this high priest servant, but about most high priest servants, that they were the ones that went and did the evil deeds that the high priest wanted done that he couldn't do himself. Josephus is a very interesting read if you ever get the time. He wrote several books. It's quite lengthy, but the more you know of your Bible, the more interesting it is. But this is the vice president to the president. And daggum Peter steps up and he's going to split his skull wide open. We're going to get out of here, Jesus. And he swings. Thank God he only gets his ear. So Jesus steps in to fix Peter's screw up. First, he explains to Peter that I'm in control of the situation. Chill. And none of this would be happening if I didn't allow it to happen. Notice what Jesus said in verses 53 and 54. Don't you realize, Peter, that I could ask my Father for thousands of angels to protect us, and he would send them, I love this word, instantly. Because they're just in another dimension. All they got to do is step into this dimension. Boom, they would be here. But if I did, how would the scriptures be fulfilled that describe, now notice this, what must day it is necessary. What must happen now? In other words, I could stop this, Peter, but it's God's will that I allow it to happen. It's okay. Chill. And then Luke tells us that Jesus touched the man's ear, which was probably hanging by a thin strip of skin. And he was instantly healed. Look at Luke 22, verse 51. But Jesus said, no more of this. And he touched the man's ear and healed him. Malchus' ear was miraculously reattached to his head with no indication that it had ever happened. In other words, no harm, no foul. Can't bring charges against Peter. Show the evidence. There's none. There's not even any blood. So now the disciples, including Peter, are free to go without being arrested with Jesus. Now this too is a fulfillment of prophecy. Look back at John chapter 18, verses 8 and 9. I told you that I am, Jesus said, and since I am the one you want, let these others go. He did this to fulfill his own statement, I did not lose a single one of those you have given me. Now, if you understand what this is referring to, is that a little earlier, Jesus had prayed for his disciples. It's called his high priestly prayer. And when he's praying in John chapter 17, verse number 12, he said that I've not lost any of them you give, save the son of perdition. That's not added here in John, but that's actually what it says. The reason John doesn't put it, because he expects you to start reading his gospel and read it from the beginning to end, and you'll know what he prayed for. Jesus prayed and he said, God, I've not lost anyone, save the son of perdition. Anyone know what perdition means? Damnation. Who's the son of damnation? Bless his heart, Judas. If Judas would have just hung on for 3 days, I believe he would have repented and been saved. But before Jesus was resurrected, he was like all the other disciples. He thought it was over, and racked with guilt, he went out and hung himself. God fixed Peter's screw up, or Jesus fixed Peter's screw up, but he couldn't fix Judas because Judas didn't allow it to happen. So Peter screwed up, but Jesus fixed his screw up. And people, that's what Jesus does for us. He fixes our screw up.